I grew up in a part of town where the streetlights worked only half the time, and the other half you learned to walk fast. My father drove a delivery truck for a grocery distributor. 20 years with the same company, same routes, same early mornings that turned his face gray before he hit 50. My mother cleaned houses in neighborhoods where people had landscapers and security systems and marble countertops that cost more than our annual rent. She came home every night smelling like other people's expensive cleaning products, her knees aching, her hands raw from chemicals that promised to make everything shine. My younger sister Talia was 8 years younger than me, which meant that by the time I was old enough to understand what our situation really was, she was still young enough to believe things might get better. She was 6 when I started high school, all big eyes and questions I didn't know how to answer. Why did we live in an apartment when her friend Samantha lived in a house? Why couldn't Mom pick her up from school like the other moms? Why did Dad look so tired all the time? I didn't tell her the truth, that we were one medical emergency away from losing everything, that my parents worked themselves to exhaustion just to keep us fed and housed, that the American dream they'd believed in had turned out to be a lie for people like us. Instead, I told her it would get better. I told her I was going to make it better. I was the first person in my family to go to college. Not just any college. I got into one of the top business programs in the country, a private university with an endowment larger than the GDP of small nations. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in March of my senior year. I was home alone when I opened it. I read the first line, "Congratulations," and I had to sit down on the kitchen floor because my legs stopped working. I got in on merit and financial aid, a combination of grants and loans that would take me years to pay off, but at the time it felt like winning the lottery. The financial aid package covered about 60% of the costs. The rest would come from federal loans, work-study, and whatever summer jobs I could piece together. It meant I'd graduate with about $80,000 in debt, a number that made my stomach turn, but everyone told me it was worth it. An education like that, from a school like that, it would pay for itself 10 times over. My parents cried when I showed them the letter. My mother held it in her hands like it was made of glass, reading it over and over, her lips moving silently. My father shook my hand. He wasn't a hugger, and his grip was so tight it hurt. He didn't say anything, but his eyes were wet. Talia, who was 10 by then, asked if this meant we were rich now. Not yet, I told her, but someday. The message was clear, even if no one said it out loud. This was the way out. This was how we stopped being the people who got overlooked, underestimated and underpaid. I wasn't just going for myself. I was going for all of us. Every late night, my mother spent scrubbing someone else's bathroom. Every early morning, my father spent loading trucks in the freezing cold. It was all building toward this, toward me, toward the idea that one of us could break through, could make it, could prove that hard work actually meant something. I carried that weight with me when I moved into the dorms in late August. The campus looked like something out of a movie. Old brick buildings covered in ivy, perfectly manicured lawns that someone must have maintained full-time, students walking around in clothes that cost more than my parents made in a month. There were kids unloading SUVs filled with furniture, mini fridges, expensive laptops still in their boxes. Parents hired moving services to carry their children's belongings up to the dorms. I carried everything I owned in 2 duffel bags and a backpack. I felt out of place immediately, but I told myself that didn't matter. I was smart. I worked hard. That was supposed to be enough. My roommate was a guy named Curtis Hendricks. I knew his name before I knew his face. The housing portal had matched us up over the summer, and I'd looked him up online out of curiosity. His family owned a chain of mid-sized manufacturing plants across the Midwest. Not billionaire money, but comfortable, very comfortable. The kind of money that meant he'd never had to think about money. He showed up 3 hours after I did, driven by his parents in a car that probably cost more than my entire 4 years of tuition. They helped him move in, his mother fussing over where to put things, his father making jokes about the size of the dorm room. And then they took us both out to dinner at a restaurant downtown, where the cheapest entree was $35. I ordered the second cheapest thing on the menu and barely ate half of it. Curtis was easy to like, that was the thing. That caught me off guard. I'd expected him to be an asshole, the rich kid who looked down on everyone, who coasted on his family name, who treated college like an extended vacation. But he wasn't like that. He was easygoing, funny, good-looking in a way that made people want to be around him. He wore expensive clothes, but never made a big deal about it. He introduced me to his parents like I was someone worth knowing. When the check came, his father paid without looking at it, and Curtis didn't even notice. We became friends almost immediately. It wasn't strategic on my part. I wasn't thinking about what he could do for me, or what kind of connections he might have. I just liked him. He made me laugh. He was curious about people in a way that felt genuine. He asked me about my family, my hometown, what had made me want to study business, and he actually listened to the answers. Curtis wasn't the smartest guy in our program, but he didn't need to be. He had something better, confidence. He walked into rooms like he belonged there, and people believed him. Professors liked him. Other students wanted to be in his study groups. He had a way of making you feel like you were part of something just by being near him. When he suggested getting lunch, it felt like an invitation to something exclusive. When he introduced you to someone, it felt like he was vouching for you. I, on the other hand, had to fight for every bit of respect I got. I was the kid who stayed up late in the library, who asked too many questions in class, who took notes like my life depended on it, because it did. I didn't have a safety net. If I failed out, I went back to a life I was desperate to escape. I went back to watching my parents work themselves to death for nothing. But I was good. Better than good. I understood the material in a way that went beyond memorization. I could see patterns in data, connections between theories, implications that other students missed. By the end of freshman year, I had the highest GPA in our cohort, a 3.97, pulled down only by a B+ in a statistics class where the professor had graded on attendance as much as performance, and I'd missed 2 classes when my mother had a health scare and I'd gone home for a long weekend. Professors started to notice me. I got invited to a research assistant position with one of the top economists on campus, a woman named Professor Daphne Ramsey, who was doing groundbreaking work on labor market dynamics. She paid me $12 an hour to help with data analysis and literature reviews, and I would have done it for free just to have her name on my resume. I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, hard work really did matter more than background. Curtis and I became close. We studied together, or rather, I studied, and he asked questions until he understood the material well enough to pass. We went to parties together, though I never drank much because I couldn't afford to lose a morning too, a hangover. We complained about the same professors, laughed at the same jokes, developed the kind of shorthand that comes from spending too much time in close quarters. He introduced me to people I never would have met on my own. Kids whose parents ran hedge funds and sat on corporate boards, whose high schools had had their own investment clubs, who talked about summer internships at Goldman Sachs like they were discussing summer camp. These were people who'd grown up knowing how the world worked, who understood the unwritten rules, who had networks that stretched back generations. I introduced Curtis to the unglamorous reality of actually doing the work. I taught him how to build a financial model from scratch, how to read a 10K filing, how to prepare for exams in a way that actually stuck. It felt like a fair trade. We were both ambitious, but in different ways. Curtis wanted to prove himself, to show that he was more than just his family name, that he could succeed on his own merits. I wanted to prove that I belonged in a world that had never been designed for people like me. We talked about the future constantly, about the firms we wanted to work for, the kind of money we wanted to make, the lives we wanted to build. By sophomore year, we'd settled into a rhythm. Curtis pledged a fraternity, one of the top ones on campus, the kind that had produced senators and CEOs, and I joined the Business Honor Society. He went to formals and mixers and networking events, where alumni handed out internships like party favors. I went to career fairs and cold emailed professionals asking for informational interviews, and spent my spring break applying to summer programs. Curtis landed an internship at a boutique investment bank in Chicago through a family friend. I landed one at a corporate finance department of a regional insurance company through the career services office. His paid $7,500 for 10 weeks. Mine paid $3,500. I didn't complain. I couldn't afford to. Junior year was when everything started to crystallize. We both knew that the summer between junior and senior year was the most important. That was when you landed the internship that turned into a full-time offer, the one that set the trajectory for everything that came after. The firms came to campus in the fall, and the competition was brutal. Everyone in our program was smart, driven, polished. Everyone had learned to dress the part, to speak the language, to network like their lives depended on it. Curtis and I both wanted to go into finance or consulting, the kind of jobs that started at 6 figures and only went up from there. The difference was, Curtis wanted to prove he was more than just his family name. I wanted to prove I was more than where I came from. We studied together for the interviews, case studies, market analyses, behavioral questions. Curtis was better at the soft stuff. He could charm anyone in 30 seconds. I was better. At the technical stuff, I could build a DCF model in my sleep. We practiced on each other, critiquing each other's answers, pushing each other to be sharper. "You need to smile more," Curtis told me after a mock interview. "You come across as too intense, like you're trying too hard." "I am trying hard," I said. "I know. But you can't let them see it. You have to act like you belong there, even if you don't believe it yet." I tried to take his advice. I tried to be more relaxed, more natural, more like him, but it never felt authentic. I was always performing, always aware of the gap between who I was and who I was supposed to be. That spring, a company called Hendricks Capital Group came to campus to recruit. They were a mid-sized private equity firm based in the city, the kind of place that didn't make headlines but quietly made millions. They specialized in lower middle market buyouts, acquiring struggling companies, turning them around, and selling them for a profit. It was unglamorous work compared to the big-name firms, but it was respected, and more importantly, they had a reputation for giving real responsibility to junior employees. They were looking for a single analyst position, a post-graduation role that would start immediately after commencement. It was the kind of opportunity people in our program dreamed about. High pay, real deal experience, and a clear path to promotion for anyone who proved themselves. Curtis and I both applied. So did about 40 other students from our program alone. The first round was a resume screen. I made it through. So did Curtis. So did maybe 20 others. The second round was a technical interview, an hour-long conversation where they walked you through a case study and evaluated your ability to think on your feet. My interviewer was a senior associate named Tobias McLean, a guy in his early 30s who'd been with the firm for 6 years. He gave me a scenario, a manufacturing company with declining revenues, high fixed costs, and an aging customer base. What would I do? I walked him through my analysis step by step. I identified the core problems: over-reliance on a single product line, failure to innovate, inefficient operations. I proposed solutions: diversify the product portfolio, invest in automation to reduce costs, explore strategic partnerships to access new markets. I backed everything up with numbers, with frameworks, with examples from cases I'd studied. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked follow-up questions, hard ones. Questions designed to poke holes in my logic, to see if I'd really thought it through, or if I was just reciting textbook answers. I held my ground. I defended my analysis. I admitted when I didn't know something and explained how I'd find out. At the end, he closed his laptop and looked at me directly. "You're very well prepared," he said. "Thank you. Why do you want to work in private equity?" I'd practiced this answer a dozen times, but in the moment, I decided to tell the truth. "I want to understand how businesses work," I said. "Not just in theory, but in practice. I want to be in a position where I can see the full life cycle of a company, where it struggles, how it can be fixed, what it takes to create real value, and I want to do it somewhere that will actually let me contribute, not just watch from the sidelines." He nodded slowly. "Fair answer." "Also," I added, "I need to make money. I have student loans, and I have a family that's counting on me. I'm not going to pretend that's not part of it." He smiled at that. "I appreciate the honesty. Most people try to make it sound like they're doing this to save the world. I'm not trying to save the world. I'm trying to save my family." He stood up and shook my hand. "We'll be in touch." I walked out of that interview feeling like I'd done everything I could. I'd been prepared, confident, honest. I'd shown them who I was and what I was capable of. Curtis's interview was the same day, scheduled 2 hours after mine. We'd agreed to meet up afterward and compare notes, but when I texted him, he said he was going to grab dinner with some friends from his fraternity, and he'd catch up with me later. I went back to the library and tried to study for an upcoming exam, but I couldn't focus. I kept replaying the interview in my head, analyzing every answer, every reaction, trying to figure out if I'd done enough. A week later, we both got emails inviting us to the final round. This wasn't an interview in the traditional sense. The firm was hosting a private reception at an upscale hotel downtown, a chance for the final candidates to meet the leadership team in a more informal setting. The email said the dress code was business casual. It said to bring our best selves. It said that final decisions would be made within 2 weeks of the event. There were 8 of us invited, Curtis and I, plus 6 others from schools, across the region. It felt surreal to be in the final group, to be this close to something that could change everything. I borrowed a blazer from Curtis. I couldn't afford anything that would fit the dress code otherwise. Mine was a cheap navy blue thing I'd bought at a discount store for career fairs, and it looked like exactly what it was. Curtis's blazer was charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, made from some kind of wool blend that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. It fit me reasonably well, though the shoulders were a little wide. "Looks good," Curtis said when I tried it on. "Keep it. I've got 3 others." The reception was on a Friday night in late April. The hotel was downtown, the kind of place I'd only ever seen in movies. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, staff in white gloves who moved through the space like ghosts. The lobby smelled like expensive cologne and fresh flowers. I felt like an imposter the moment I walked in, but I forced myself to smile and shake hands and pretend I belonged. The event was in a large ballroom on the third floor. When I arrived, about half the candidates were already there, along with 4 people I recognized from the firm's website. I grabbed a sparkling water from the bar, I didn't trust myself with alcohol, and started working the room. The first person I talked to was one of the other candidates, a woman named Priya Baxter from a university 3 states over. She was sharp, confident, and clearly just as nervous as I was. We made small talk for a few minutes, where we went to school, what we were studying, what we thought of the firm, before we were interrupted by one of the partners, Malcolm Porter. I recognized him from the website, late 40s, Harvard MBA, 20 years in private equity. He was one of the 3 senior partners who ran the firm, and his bio listed him as the head of deal origination. "Don't let me interrupt," he said with a smile that seemed genuine. "I just wanted to introduce myself, Malcolm Porter." We shook hands. His grip was firm, practiced. "I've been looking forward to meeting both of you," he continued. "I reviewed your materials personally. Very impressive backgrounds." Priya and I thanked him, and he asked us a few questions. Nothing technical, just conversational. What had drawn us to private equity? What kind of companies we found interesting? What we did outside of school? I let Priya answer most of the questions. She was better at this than I was, more relaxed, more articulate. I chimed in when it made sense, but mostly I observed. I watched how Malcolm listened, how he responded, what seemed to interest him. After about 10 minutes, he excused himself to talk to other candidates, and Priya and I were left alone again. "He seemed nice," she said. "Yeah. You okay? You seem tense." "I'm fine, just want to make a good impression." She smiled. "You're doing fine, just breathe." Curtis arrived about 20 minutes later, looking completely at ease in a navy suit that probably cost more than my semester's rent. He spotted me across the room and came over, greeting Priya warmly before pulling me aside. "How's it going?" he asked. "Good, I think. You?" "Same. This is wild, right? We're actually here." "Yeah. I talked to Malcolm earlier. He mentioned you. Said you had a really strong interview." "He said that?" "Yeah, I think you got a real shot at this." I wanted to believe him, but I'd learned not to get my hopes up. I'd been the best candidate before and still lost out to someone with better connections, better polish, better luck. The reception lasted 3 hours. I talked to all 4 of the firm's representatives who were there. Malcolm Porter, a junior partner named Jerome Hughes, a senior associate named Tobias McLean, who'd conducted my technical interview, and the firm's founder and managing partner, a woman named Rosalind Carlson. Rosalind was the most intimidating person I'd ever met. She was in her early 50s, elegant and sharp, with gray hair cut into a severe bob and eyes that seemed to see straight through you. She'd founded Hendricks Capital 15 years earlier after leaving a larger firm, and she'd built it into one of the most respected names in the lower middle market space. She ran the firm with absolute authority, and everyone deferred to her. When she approached me, about 2 hours into the event, I felt my heart rate spike. "You're the one who told Tobias you're doing this to save your family," she said. No introduction, no small talk. "Yes, ma'am." "That's refreshing. Most of these kids are here because they think finance is glamorous, or because their parents push them into it. You know what you want." "I do." "Why should I hire you?" The question caught me off guard. This wasn't supposed to be an interview. This was supposed to be informal, relaxed. A chance to see if we were a good cultural fit. But Rosalind clearly didn't care about the script. "Because I'll work harder than anyone else," I said. "Because I understand what's at stake, and because I'll do whatever it takes to prove I belong here." She studied me for a long moment. "You have a chip on your shoulder." "Yes, ma'am." "Good, keep it. The day you lose that chip is the day you stop being useful." She walked away without another word. I stood there, processing what had just happened, wondering if I'd impressed her or offended her, or something in between. Around 9 o'clock, I excused myself to use the restroom. The event was winding down, and I needed a moment to myself, to process everything, to quiet the anxiety that had been building all night. The bathrooms were down a side hallway, past a few smaller conference rooms. I walked down the corridor, found the men's room, and on my way back I noticed that one of the conference room doors was slightly ajar. I don't know why I looked. Curiosity maybe, boredom, the kind of instinct that makes you glance into lit windows when you walk past houses at night. The room was dimly lit, just a desk lamp on a side table casting long shadows across the space. And there, on the couch against the far wall, were two people, Curtis and Rosalind Carlson. They weren't talking, they were kissing. His hand was on her waist, her fingers were in his hair. They were pressed together in a way that left no ambiguity about what was happening. I froze. My brain refused to process what I was seeing for a full 5 seconds. It was like watching something on a screen, something that wasn't quite real, something that couldn't possibly be happening. Then it clicked all at once, and I stepped back from the door so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. My heart was hammering, my hands were shaking. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. I stood there in the hallway, trying to figure out what to do. Should I leave? Should I say something? Should I pretend I hadn't seen anything? Were they going to come out and see me standing here? Had they seen me? I forced myself to move. I walked back to the ballroom on legs that didn't feel like my own. I grabbed my coat from the coat check. I found Malcolm Porter and thanked him for the evening, shook his hand, told him I looked forward to hearing from them. He smiled and said he was confident we'd have good news soon. I left. I took the metro back to campus because I couldn't afford an Uber, and the whole ride I stared at my reflection in the window and tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Curtis and Rosalind, the founder of the firm, the woman who would make the final hiring decision, and my best friend. I got back to the dorm around 11. Curtis wasn't there. I sat at my desk, staring at my laptop without seeing it, my mind racing through possibilities. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe they were just talking and I'd misread the situation in the dim light. No, I knew what I'd seen. Maybe it was a one-time thing. Maybe it didn't mean anything. But even as I thought it, I knew that was naive. Curtis had access to something I would never have, and he'd used it. He came back to the dorm around midnight. I heard his key in the lock, heard him come in, drop his keys on his dresser, kick off his shoes. "Hey," he said, "you left early." I didn't turn around. "Yeah, wasn't feeling great." "Too bad. I think it went well, though. Really well." "Good. You okay?" "Just tired." "All right. Well, I'm gonna crash. Big day tomorrow. Some of the guys from the house are doing a charity run thing." "Cool." He got ready for bed. I listened to him brush his teeth, change into pajamas, settle into his bed across the room. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything I'd seen, everything I knew, everything I'd worked for. And I knew with absolute certainty how this was going to end. 2 weeks later, the firm sent out their decision emails. I was in the library when mine came through. It was 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. I'd been studying for a final exam, but I'd been checking my email compulsively every 15 minutes for days. The subject line said, "Hendricks Capital Group, Analyst position update. I opened it. Dear name, thank you for your interest in Hendricks Capital Group and for taking the time to meet with our team. We were impressed by your qualifications and enjoyed getting to know you throughout the recruitment process. After careful consideration, we have decided to move forward with another candidate whose experience more closely aligns with our current needs. This was an extremely competitive process, and we encourage you to apply for future opportunities with our firm. We wish you the best in your future endeavors. I read it 3 times. Then I closed my laptop. I sat there in the library, surrounded by other students cramming for exams, and I felt something inside me crack. I'd worked harder than anyone. I'd prepared more. I'd been better in every measurable way. And it didn't matter, because Curtis had something I didn't. Access. I gathered my things slowly, methodically. I walked back to the dorm. Curtis wasn't there. He was probably out celebrating with his fraternity brothers, telling everyone about his new job, about how he'd landed his dream position at a top firm, about how his future was set. I opened my laptop again and checked the business school's employment outcomes board, where students could voluntarily post their post-graduation plans. Curtis had already updated his. Analyst, Hendricks Capital Group. I stared at it until the words stopped making sense. Then I opened a new document and started writing down everything I knew, everything I'd seen, everything I could prove, and everything I couldn't, not yet. The last month of senior year passed in a blur. I showed up to classes, took my finals, went through the motions of graduation preparation. I smiled when people asked about my post-grad plans. I said I was still exploring options, still figuring things out, keeping my possibilities open. I didn't tell anyone that I'd applied to 63 different positions in the month after Curtis got his offer. I didn't tell anyone that I'd gotten exactly 4 first-round interviews, all of which had led nowhere. I didn't tell anyone that I was starting to panic. Curtis, meanwhile, was riding high. He'd signed his offer letter 2 days after getting it. He spent the last weeks of school coasting, skipping classes he didn't need for his GPA, going to parties every weekend, planning his move to the city with the kind of casual confidence that comes from never having had to worry about anything. We still lived in the same room, but the friendship had developed cracks I couldn't ignore. He'd tried to include me in conversations about his plans, ask me what I was thinking of doing, offer to put me in touch with people at other firms. I made excuses. I said I was busy. I said I'd figure it out. The truth was, I couldn't be around him anymore. Every time I looked at him, I saw that conference room. I saw him with Rosalind. I saw the door that had been opened for him that would never open for me. And I hated him for it. Not in a loud, explosive way, in a quiet, corrosive way that ate at me from the inside. Graduation came on a warm Saturday in May. My parents drove up with Talia, who was 14 now and taller than I remembered. We took pictures on the lawn, me in my rented cap and gown, my parents beaming with pride they couldn't afford to feel given what came next. The ceremony itself was forgettable. Speeches about potential and opportunity and the future we were walking into. A keynote from some tech executive who told us we were the leaders of tomorrow. Names read in alphabetical order, diplomas handed out assembly line style. When they called my name, I walked across the stage, shook the dean's hand, and took my diploma. It felt hollow. Afterward, we went to a diner off campus. It was the same place we'd gone after my college acceptance 4 years earlier. My father ordered coffee and didn't finish it. My mother asked about my job search. "How's it going?" she asked carefully. "Still waiting to hear back from a few places. But you've got some good options?" I couldn't lie to her. Not directly. I'm working on it. She nodded, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She knew what the debt looked like. She knew what was riding on this. Talia thankfully changed the subject. She told me about her school, about the debate team she'd joined, about a history teacher who'd encouraged her to think about applying to college programs for gifted students. I listened and tried to be present, but part of me was already calculating. If I didn't find something soon, I'd have to start making loan payments in 6 months. Minimum payments on $80,000 in debt would be around $800 a month, and that was assuming I could stay on the standard repayment plan. Without a job in finance, I'd be looking at entry-level corporate positions that paid maybe $40,000 or $45,000 a year. In a high cost of living city, that was barely survivable. After lunch, my parents and Talia headed back. They had a 6-hour drive ahead of them. I hugged them goodbye in the parking lot, promised I'd call soon, watched them drive away in my father's 15-year-old sedan. Then I went back to the dorm and started packing. I had 3 days to move out. Most of my stuff fit in the same 2 duffel bags I'd arrived with. 4 years, and I still didn't own much. Curtis was already gone. He'd moved out 2 days earlier, his parents hiring a moving service to transport everything to his new apartment in the city, a 1-bedroom in a nice neighborhood that his parents were covering for the first year until he got settled. He'd left me a note on my desk. "Thanks for everything, man. Couldn't have made it through without you. Let's stay in touch. C." I threw it away. A week later, I moved back home. My old bedroom was exactly as I'd left it. Posters on the walls from high school, a twin bed that felt too small, a desk where I'd spent countless nights studying for AP exams and writing college essays. It felt like going backward. I took a job at a financial services call center on the edge of town. They hired anyone with a college degree and paid $14 an hour. The work was mind-numbing, answering phones, helping customers understand their credit card statements, dealing with people who were angry about interest rates and late fees and policies I had no control over. I worked 8-hour shifts 5 days a week. During my lunch breaks, I sent out job applications. During my evenings, I sent out more applications. I applied to analyst programs, associate positions, corporate strategy roles, anything that might use my degree. I got rejection after rejection, or worse, I got nothing at all. Curtis, meanwhile, started his job at Hendricks Capital in June. He posted about it on social media. Pictures of his first day, his new office, team lunches with his colleagues. He looked happy, he looked successful, he looked like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. I stopped following him online. By August, I'd sent out over 100 applications and had exactly 2 phone screens to show for it, both of which had gone nowhere. I started to accept that maybe this was it. Maybe I'd graduated from a top program and still ended up exactly where I'd started. Maybe the system really was rigged, and I'd been stupid to believe otherwise. And then Talia's situation got worse. She'd started high school that fall at the public school in our district, the same one I'd gone to, the one with overcrowded classrooms and underpaid teachers and bathrooms that hadn't been updated since the 1980s. It was a rough place, but it was free, and my parents couldn't afford private school. Within the first month, the bullying began. It wasn't physical, it was worse. It was the kind of slow, social cruelty that left no visible marks but destroyed you from the inside. Girls who wouldn't sit near her at lunch. Boys who made jokes about her clothes, her backpack, the fact that she took the bus instead of getting dropped off by a parent. Teachers who saw it happening and did nothing, or worse, seemed to blame her for not fitting in. My mother told me about it one night when I got home from work. Talia had come home crying, locked herself in her room, and refused to talk about what had happened. Eventually, my mother had gotten it out of her. She'd been working on a group project in her English class, and when they'd split up to work on different sections, one of the other girls had told her she shouldn't be in charge of anything important because people like her didn't really contribute. People like her. Because we were poor. Because we lived in the wrong neighborhood. Because she showed up to school in clothes from discount stores and carried a backpack that was 3 years old. My mother told me this in the kitchen, her voice low and shaking with fury she had no outlet for, and I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Clarity. I couldn't fix my own situation. The world had made it clear that hard work wasn't enough, that being smart wasn't enough, that doing everything right still meant you could lose to someone who just had better access. But I could do something about this. I could protect Talia. I could give her the opportunities I'd been denied. And I could do it in a way that no one would ever know. That night, after my parents went to bed, I sat in my room and made a plan. I was going to disappear, not literally, but from the life I'd been trying to build. I was going to stop chasing the same jobs, the same trajectory, the same validation from a system that had already shown me it didn't care. I was going to work quietly, build resources invisibly, and use everything I made to get Talia out. Out of that school, out of that neighborhood, out of the life that would crush her the same way it had almost crushed me. And I was going to do it without anyone knowing. Because if they knew, if my parents knew, if Talia knew, they'd try to stop me. They'd say I was sacrificing too much, that I needed to focus on my own future, that I couldn't carry the weight of the family on my shoulders. But they were wrong. I could carry it. I had to. Because if I didn't, who would? I started researching that same night. I looked into remote work opportunities, freelance consulting positions, contract work that didn't require a permanent address or a traditional employment structure. The gig economy was still relatively new, but it was growing, and there were opportunities for people with financial analysis skills who were willing to work for less than the big firms charged. I found a small financial analysis firm based in another state that hired contractors to build models and write reports for clients they didn't have the bandwidth to serve directly. They paid $35 an hour, more than double what I was making at the call center, and they didn't care where you lived or what your background was. They cared about deliverables. I applied under a slightly modified version of my identity. Not illegal. I wasn't committing fraud or evading taxes. I just used my middle name, Oscar, combined with my mother's maiden name, Bishop. Oscar Bishop. Professional enough. Anonymous enough. They hired me within a week. The work was straightforward at first. Building basic financial models for small businesses, creating pitch decks for startups seeking funding, doing market research for companies exploring new product lines. Nothing glamorous, but it was real work that used my skills. I quit the call center and started working from home full-time. For the first few months, I worked 12 to 14 hours a day. I'd wake up at 6, make coffee, and start working. I'd take a break for lunch, usually something cheap I could make quickly, and then work straight through until 8 or 9 at night. Sometimes later, I didn't go out, I didn't socialize, I didn't have friends, I just worked. My parents thought I was still figuring things out, trying to find my footing after graduation. They didn't ask too many questions. They were too worried about their own jobs, their own bills, their own exhaustion. Talia was the only one who seemed to notice something was different. "You're always on your computer," she said one Saturday afternoon, standing in my doorway. "Work stuff," I said. "What kind of work?" "Financial analysis, consulting, boring stuff." "Is it a good job?" "It's fine." She studied me for a moment, and I could see the wheels turning in her head. She was smart, smarter than I'd been at 14, and she knew something was off, but she didn't push. "Okay," she said. "Well, I'm going to Samantha's house if Mom asks. Be safe." She left, and I went back to work. By the end of my first year working as Oscar Bishop, I'd saved $18,000. It doesn't sound like much, 18,000 over a full year of brutal, isolating work, but it was more than I'd ever had at one time. It was more than my parents had in their savings account. It was leverage, and I put every cent of it toward Talia. I found a private school across town, not one of the elite prep schools that cost $40,000 a year, but a solid mid-tier private institution with small class sizes, good teachers, and an actual anti-bullying policy that they enforced. Tuition was $12,000 a year. I couldn't pay it all at once without raising questions, so I broke it up. I created a story, told the school that Talia had been awarded a partial scholarship through an anonymous donor who wanted to help talented students from underserved communities. I paid the first semester in cash, through a series of checks that couldn't be traced back to me. The school bought it. My parents thought it was financial aid. Talia thought she'd just gotten lucky. She started at the new school in January of her freshman year. Within a month, everything changed. She came home smiling again. She talked about her classes, her teachers, the friends she was making. She joined the debate team. She started doing better academically, not because she wasn't smart before, but because she was finally in an environment that let her thrive. I watched her transform, and I knew I had made the right decision. And I kept working. I took on more clients. I raised my rates. I got better at the work, faster, more efficient. I learned to spot patterns in data that other analysts missed. I started getting repeat business referrals, requests for more complex projects. Within 2 years, I was making close to $80,000 a year as Oscar Bishop. I still lived with my parents. I still worked from my childhood bedroom. I still didn't go out, didn't date, didn't have any kind of life outside of the work and the mission. But I was building something. I paid for Talia's tuition every year. I paid for her debate team trips. I paid for SAT prep courses. I set up a college fund that would make sure she could go anywhere she wanted without drowning in debt the way I had. And I never told her, because the moment she knew, the moment anyone knew, it would change things. She'd feel guilty. She'd try to refuse. She'd say I was giving up too much, but I wasn't giving up anything. I was investing in the only thing that mattered. By the time Talia was 16, she was thriving. She was captain of the debate team. She had a 4.0 GPA. She had friends who respected her, teachers who believed in her, a future that wasn't limited by where she came from. And I stayed invisible. I kept working as Oscar Bishop. I kept building my skills, my client base, my savings. I kept watching my college classmates post about their promotions, their new apartments, their engagement photos, their lives that looked nothing like mine. Curtis was one of them. I didn't follow him anymore, but information has a way of finding you. Mutual friends from school would mention him in passing. The business school alumni newsletter would feature updates on recent graduates, and his name would appear, promoted to senior analyst, working on major deals, engaged to someone whose family owned a string of hotels. He looked untouchable. He looked like he'd won. And maybe he had for now, but I was patient, because I knew something he didn't. I knew that the foundation his success was built on was rotten. I knew that Rosalind Carlson had given him an opportunity he hadn't earned. I knew that everything he had could be traced back to a lie, and I knew that lies, eventually, have a way of surfacing. I just had to wait, and I was very good at waiting. By the time I was 27, I'd saved just over $200,000. Not all at once, some years were better than others, and there were times when client work dried up and I had to hustle to keep the income steady. But I was disciplined, I lived cheaply, I saved aggressively. Every dollar that didn't go to Talia's education went into a savings account that I barely touched. $200,000. In Curtis's world, that was nothing. That was what people spent on cars, on weddings, on down payments for second homes. But for me, it was everything. It was freedom. It was leverage. It was the difference between being stuck and being able to move. I'd also built a reputation in the financial analysis world, even if almost no one knew my real identity. As Oscar Bishop, I'd worked with clients across 3 continents. I'd helped structure deals worth tens of millions. I'd developed a specialty in turnaround situations, analyzing struggling companies, identifying their core problems, and building roadmaps for recovery. People requested me by name. Well, by the name they knew me by. I was good at what I did, better than good. And slowly, quietly, I was building the kind of expertise that firms like Hendricks Capital paid 6 figures for. But I was also tired. Not physically, though I was that too. I was tired of being invisible. I was tired of watching Curtis build a life on a foundation I knew was compromised. I was tired of pretending I didn't care. I was 27 years old. I'd spent the last 5 years working in isolation, sacrificing any semblance of a normal life, all in service of a mission that had consumed everything. And I started to wonder, what was I building toward? Talia was doing well. She was a junior in high school now, talking about college applications, about schools like the one I'd gone to. She had options I'd made sure she'd have. My parents were okay, not thriving, but stable. I'd been helping with their bills quietly, anonymously, the same way I'd been helping Talia. I'd accomplished what I'd set out to do, but it wasn't enough, because Curtis was still out there, still succeeding, still living a life built on something I'd seen with my own eyes. And I wanted him to fall, not out of pure spite, though there was some of that, but because I needed to know that the world could be fair, even if you had to force it to be. I needed to know that lies didn't always win, that access and privilege couldn't protect you forever. So I stopped running from my old life. I decided to come back. I started by shutting down most of my Oscar Bishop work. I kept a few long-term clients for income stability, but I stopped taking new contracts. Instead, I started rebuilding my professional identity under my real name. I updated my resume with the work I'd been doing, carefully framed, properly cited, all above board. I started networking again, reaching out to people I'd gone to school with, attending industry events, making myself visible in the same circles where Curtis operated. I applied for positions at mid-tier consulting and advisory firms, places that were respectable but not elite, roles that wouldn't draw too much attention but would give me credibility and access. I got offers. 3 of them, actually. I chose a corporate strategy consultancy based in the same city where Curtis worked, not because I wanted to run into him, though I knew it was inevitable, but because that's where the work was, where the opportunities were, where I needed to be to do what I was planning. I moved to the city in the spring, found a small apartment in a neighborhood that was transitioning from rough to trendy, cheap enough that I could keep saving, nice enough that I didn't feel like I was living in a dorm room. I started my new job in June. The work was similar to what I'd been doing as Oscar Bishop, but now I had a team, an office, actual colleagues. It was strange at first, being around people again, having to make small talk, having to pretend I cared about March Madness brackets and weekend plans. But I adapted. I was good at the work, better than most of my colleagues. Within a few months, I was leading client engagements, presenting to executives, building a reputation as someone who could solve complex problems quickly. And I started to position myself. I made it known that I was interested in private equity and finance. I attended industry networking events. I joined professional associations. I made myself visible in the ecosystem where Curtis operated. And then I waited for our paths to cross. It happened on a Thursday in October at a financial services networking mixer, one of those events where people drink overpriced wine and exchange business cards and pretend to be interested in each other's quarterly projections. I saw Curtis before he saw me. He was across the room, talking to a group of 4 people who were all leaning in slightly, hanging on his words. He looked older, lines around his eyes, a more expensive suit, a watch that probably cost 5 figures. But he was still recognizably Curtis. Same easy smile, same confident posture, same ability to make people feel like being near him meant being part of something important. I watched him for a few minutes, timing my approach. When there was a natural break in his conversation, I walked over. "Curtis Hendricks," I said. He turned, and for a moment, just a fraction of a second, he didn't recognize me. Then his face transformed. Surprise, then recognition, then something that looked almost like relief. "Holy shit," he said. He pulled me into a hug that felt performative, like he was showing everyone around him that he was the kind of guy who stayed loyal to old friends. "Is that really you?" "It's me." "Man, it's been what, 5 years? 6 almost. 6 years. Unbelievable. What are you doing in the city? I thought you went back home after graduation." "I did, for a while, needed to regroup, but I've been working my way back into the industry. Just joined a consulting firm a few months ago." "That's great, really great." "Which firm?" I told him. He nodded appreciatively. "Solid place, I know some people there." Of course he did. "What about you?" I asked, even though I already knew. "Still at Hendricks?" "Yeah, 6 years in September. Senior associate now, working on some good deals." "Congratulations." "Thanks, we should catch up properly, grab drinks or something. It's been way too long." "Yeah, we should." We exchanged numbers. I made sure to program his contact information into my phone right there in front of him, so he'd know I was serious about staying in touch. He texted me 2 days later with a date and a place, an upscale bar in Midtown that he probably thought was impressive, but that I'd been to 3 times for client meetings. I met him there on a Thursday evening. He was already seated when I arrived, nursing a whiskey that probably cost $18. He stood when he saw me, shook my hand, gestured for me to sit. "Good to see you, man," he said. "You too." For the first 20 minutes, we stuck to safe territory. He told me about his work at Hendricks, about the deals he'd closed, about his promotion to senior associate. He mentioned that he was engaged, showed me a picture of his fiancée, a woman named Candace Jefferson, whose family owned a boutique hotel chain in the Northeast. She was beautiful, polished, exactly the kind of woman someone like Curtis would end up with. "Wedding's next summer," he said. "You should come." "I'd like that." He asked about my work, and I kept it vague. I said I was doing well at the consulting firm, building a client base, getting good reviews. "That's great," he said. "The grind pays off eventually." I nodded and took a sip of my drink. Then he started talking about a deal he was working on, a potential acquisition of a mid-sized manufacturing company that was underperforming but had good underlying assets. "The target's undervalued," he said, leaning forward slightly, his enthusiasm building as he talked. "But there's risk. The founder's a control freak, doesn't want to let go, and the financials are messier than they should be. But if we can clean it up and get operations running efficiently, the upside is massive. What's your read on the founder? I asked. Difficult, old school, thinks he knows better than everyone, but manageable. I've dealt with worse. How's the due diligence going? Solid. We're still working through some details, but the bones are good. I asked a few more questions, technical ones about the capital structure, the competitive landscape, the integration plan. Curtis answered confidently, and I could tell he appreciated having someone to talk to who understood their work. But I could also see the gaps in his analysis. He was missing things, making assumptions that weren't necessarily supported by the data, overestimating his ability to turn around a founder who didn't want to be turned around. And I said nothing. Over the next few months, Curtis and I fell into a pattern. We'd meet for drinks every 3 or 4 weeks, sometimes more often if he had something he wanted to talk through. He'd update me on his deals, his frustrations, his ambitions. He'd vent about his bosses, about the pressure to perform, about the difficulty of managing demanding clients. And I'd listen. I'd ask the right questions. I'd offer insights when it made sense. He started to trust me again, not in a deep, vulnerable way. Curtis didn't do vulnerability, but he trusted me as a sounding board, as someone who understood the world he operated in, as someone who had no reason to compete with him or undermine him. And slowly, carefully, I started to nudge him, not in obvious ways, just small suggestions, gentle encouragement toward decisions that looked promising on the surface, but had hidden risks underneath. When he talked about the manufacturing deal, the one with the difficult founder, I validated his optimism. Sounds like a good opportunity, I said. Risky, but the upside is clear. If you can execute, this could be a career maker for you. He nodded eagerly. That's what I'm thinking. Just make sure you've got alignment with the founder. Those situations can go sideways fast if there's not trust on both sides. Yeah, I know. We're working on it. I didn't tell him that alignment with a founder who felt like he was being forced out was nearly impossible. I didn't tell him that deals like this collapsed more often than they succeeded. I didn't tell him that he was overconfident. I just let him believe what he wanted to believe. The manufacturing deal closed 3 months later, and within 6 months, it fell apart. The founder sabotaged the integration process, quietly, methodically, in ways that were hard to prove but impossible to recover from. Key employees left, suppliers pulled out, customers started working with competitors. The company lost value rapidly. Hendricks Capital had to inject additional capital just to keep it alive, and even then, it was clear they were going to take a significant loss. Curtis called me late on a Tuesday night, 2 weeks after the company's quarterly earnings had come in disastrously below projections. I think I fucked up, he said. His voice was rough, like he'd been drinking. What happened? The manufacturing deal. It's imploding. The founder's burning it down from the inside, and there's nothing we can do to stop it. I'm sorry, man. That's rough. I don't know how I missed it. I thought I had a handle on him. I thought we could make it work. Sometimes people are unpredictable. Malcolm's pissed. Rosalind's pissed. Everyone's asking how I let this happen. Rosalind. I hadn't heard him mention her name in years. What are they saying? That I should have seen the risks. That I pushed too hard for the deal. That I didn't do enough due diligence on the human side. Were they right? He was quiet for a long time. Maybe. I don't know. I thought I was being thorough. You were doing your best with the information you had. That's not good enough, though. Not in this business. No, I agreed. It's not. We talked for another 20 minutes. I let him vent, let him process, let him spiral just enough that he'd remember this feeling. When we hung up, I sat in my apartment and felt the first real stirring of satisfaction I'd felt in years. It wasn't enough, not yet, but it was a start. The manufacturing deal damaged Curtis's reputation at Hendrix, but it didn't destroy it. He got moved off the acquisitions team temporarily while they conducted a post-mortem on what went wrong, but within a few months, he was back to working on new opportunities. He was more cautious now, less confident. He second-guessed himself more, ran things by colleagues before committing, looked for validation in a way he never had before, and he kept calling me, not just for drinks anymore, for actual advice. He'd send me financial models and ask me to review them. He'd describe potential deals and ask for my thoughts. He'd treat me like a consultant, like someone whose judgment he trusted more than his own. I always answered, I always helped, and I always looked for the cracks. It took another year, but I found one. Curtis started talking about a new opportunity, a leveraged buyout of a mid-sized logistics company that was struggling but had solid infrastructure and a loyal customer base. It's ambitious, he said when he first brought it up. More debt than we usually take on, but if we can turn operations around and grow the top line, the returns could be incredible. What makes you think you can turn it around? The problems are fixable, they're operationally inefficient, their pricing is too low, and they're not using their capacity effectively. Classic turnaround situation. What about the management team? Weak, but that's actually good. Means we can bring in our own people without much resistance. I asked him to walk me through the numbers. He did enthusiastically, showing me projections that looked impressive on paper, but required everything to go right. What do you think? He asked when he finished. I think it's aggressive. Good aggressive or bad aggressive? I paused, like I was considering it carefully. That depends. Do you trust your ability to execute? Because this kind of deal doesn't give you much room for error. He hesitated, and I could see the doubt creeping in. I think we can do it, he said, but he sounded like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. Then you should go for it. Fortune favors the bold, right? He smiled. Yeah, you're right. I wasn't right. But he believed me. He pushed for the deal. He convinced his firm to take it on. He structured the financing, led the negotiations, oversaw the due diligence, and 6 months after closing, it was clear the deal was a disaster. The operational problems were deeper than anyone had realized. The management team quit en masse within 3 months. The customers started leaving for competitors who offered more reliable service. The debt load became unsustainable. Hendrix Capital had to write down the investment. They lost money, not enough to sink the firm, but enough that people started asking serious questions about Curtis's judgment. This time, the consequences were real. He got pulled off the deal team entirely, reassigned to portfolio management, the kind of role firms gave to people who'd proven they couldn't be trusted with new investments. His engagement to Candace fell apart around the same time. I didn't ask for details, but I heard, through mutual connections, that she'd started to have doubts about their future together, once his career trajectory started to decline. Curtis called me less often. When we did meet up, he was quieter, less sure of himself. He drank more. He looked tired in a way that went beyond late nights at the office. I don't know what I'm doing wrong, he said one night, staring into his glass. I feel like I used to understand how this worked, and now I don't. Maybe you're overthinking it. Or maybe I'm just not good enough. I didn't argue with him. My own career, meanwhile, was accelerating in ways that felt almost effortless compared to the years of grinding I'd done as Oscar Bishop. I'd transitioned out of pure consulting and into advisory work, helping mid-sized firms structure complex transactions and navigate difficult situations. I was getting referrals from satisfied clients. I was building a reputation as someone who could see through the noise and find the path forward, and people were starting to notice. I got invited to speak on panels at industry conferences. I got approached by recruiters for senior roles at larger firms. I got offers to join advisory boards. I started appearing at the same events Curtis used to dominate. And now, people who'd never given me a second glance were interested in what I had to say. One evening at a private equity conference, I ran into Malcolm Porter from Hendricks Capital. He was standing near the bar, talking to another partner from a different firm. When he saw me, he excused himself and came over. "I've been seeing your name everywhere," he said. "Malcolm, good to see you." "You too. I heard you're doing advisory work now?" "That's right." "How's it going?" "Well, very well, actually." He nodded slowly, studying me. "You were one of the final candidates for our analyst role. Back when you were finishing school, I remember your interview." "That was a long time ago. You had one of the strongest technical interviews I've ever seen. I was genuinely disappointed when we went with Curtis instead." I kept my face neutral. Decisions had to be made. "They did," he paused. "Curtis was a strong candidate too. But if I'm being honest, you would have been the safer choice." "Interesting. Look, I don't want to speak out of turn, but we might have some opportunities coming up. Advisory relationships, potentially something more formal. I think you'd be a good fit." He handed me his card. I took it, thanked him, and told him I'd think about it. I didn't call. I didn't need Hendricks Capital anymore. I needed something else. I needed to be in a position where Curtis would have to come to me. And that took more time. Another 2 years, to be exact. By the time I was 32, I was running my own advisory firm. It started small. Just me and one associate I'd hired away from my old consulting firm, a sharp analyst named Silas Kramer, who was hungry and didn't ask too many questions about my background. We rented office space in a shared workspace downtown. Nothing fancy, just desks, Wi-Fi, and a conference room we could book when we had client meetings. But we were selective. We only took on clients whose problems were genuinely complex, whose situations required real expertise to untangle. We charged premium rates, and we delivered results. Within a year, I hired a second associate. Within 2 years, we'd moved into our own office space, and I'd built a client roster that included mid-market private equity firms, family offices, and corporations going through major transitions. People started calling me when they didn't know who else to call. When traditional consulting firms gave them cookie-cutter solutions that didn't work, they called me. When investment banks told them a deal was too complicated to structure, they called me. When they needed someone who could see 3 moves ahead and build a path through chaos, they called me. I'd become the person I'd always believed I could be, just 10 years later than I'd planned, and with a completely different understanding of what power actually meant. Talia, meanwhile, had gotten into 5 top universities. She ended up choosing the same one I'd gone to, full scholarship, plus a stipend for living expenses through a program for first-generation students. She called me the day she got her acceptance letter, crying and laughing at the same time. "I can't believe it," she kept saying. "I actually did it." "You absolutely did it," I told her. "You earned this." She still didn't know what I'd done for her, the tuition I'd paid, the opportunities I'd created, the future I'd bought her at the cost of my own. Maybe someday I'd tell her, maybe I wouldn't. My parents retired that same year. I bought them a small house in a neighborhood where the streetlights actually worked, where the schools were good even though Talia didn't need them anymore, where they could finally breathe without constantly calculating whether they could afford groceries. I told them I'd gotten a signing bonus from a new client. They believed me because they wanted to believe me. And Curtis? Curtis was struggling. I heard about it through the professional grapevine. He'd left Hendricks Capital after being sidelined for 2 years, finally accepting that he wasn't going to climb back into their good graces. He'd joined a smaller private equity firm, a place looking to expand their team, where his Hendricks pedigree still meant something, even if his recent track record didn't. And that's where I made my move. The firm Curtis had joined was run by an old classmate of mine from business school, someone I'd stayed loosely in touch with over the years. When he'd mentioned they were looking to bring on experienced talent, I'd asked him to let me know if anyone interesting came across his desk. When Curtis's name came up, I'd made a call. "I know him," I said. "We went to school together. Smart guy, good instincts, but he needs structure. He's capable, but he tends to overreach if he doesn't have clear boundaries." My classmate took the feedback seriously. Curtis got hired, but in a role with significantly less autonomy than he'd had at Hendricks. More oversight, more supervision, less influence. It was a step up on paper, but it felt like a step sideways, maybe even a step down, and he didn't understand why. He reached out to me about 6 months after he'd started at the new firm. "Can we grab coffee?" his text said. "Need to talk something through." We met at a coffee shop near his office. He looked tired, not just physically, but existentially, like he'd been running for years and just realized he wasn't getting anywhere. "Thanks for meeting," he said. "Of course, what's going on?" "I feel like I'm stuck. I've been at this new firm for 6 months, and I thought it would be different, but it's the same shit. I have less autonomy than I did 2 years ago at Hendricks. They don't trust me with big decisions. Every time I propose something, someone second guesses it." "Why do you think that is?" "I don't know. Maybe my reputation is worse than I thought. Maybe people still remember the deals that went south. Maybe." He rubbed his face with both hands. "I'm starting to wonder if I'm cut out for this. Like maybe I peaked early and now I'm just, I don't know, mediocre." I let that sit for a moment. "You're not mediocre," I said finally. "You're talented. You just need to find the right environment." I thought this was the right environment. "Maybe you need to think bigger. Start your own thing. Build something from scratch where you don't have to deal with other people's baggage." He looked up at me, and for a moment, there was a flash of the old Curtis, the guy who'd believed he could do anything. "You really think I could do that?" "Why not? You've got the experience, you've got the network, you just need the confidence to bet on yourself." It was the worst possible advice I could give him, but he believed me, because I was the only person who'd stuck with him through all of it. Curtis spent the next 6 months planning to leave his firm and start his own boutique advisory practice. I encouraged him. I helped him think through the business model. I even introduced him to a few potential clients, people I knew would be demanding, difficult, unlikely to give him a second chance if he underperformed. He left his firm in March. By September, he was struggling to keep his new practice afloat. The clients I'd referred weren't satisfied. His business development wasn't generating enough leads. His overhead was higher than he'd projected. He called me less and less. And I watched from a distance as everything he'd built slowly fell apart. The endgame started by accident. One of my clients was a mid-sized media company going through a corporate restructuring. They were cleaning house, getting rid of old liabilities, documenting past business relationships to prepare for a potential sale. As part of that process, they'd hired me to review their archives and identify any partnerships or consulting arrangements that might need to be disclosed or unwound. I was going through boxes of old contracts and expense reports when I found it. A file from 7 years earlier, documenting a recruitment event that Hendricks Capital had sponsored in partnership with several universities. The event had been at an upscale hotel downtown, and buried in the expense reports was a line item for a conference room rental. Specifically, Conference Room 3B, charged to Rosalind Carlson's corporate card, on the same night as the final round reception where Curtis and I had been candidates. I stared at that line item for a long time. It wasn't proof of anything. A conference room rental could mean anything. Maybe there had been a last-minute meeting. Maybe the firm had needed extra space. Or maybe it had been where Rosalind and Curtis had been when I'd seen them through that doorway. I requested the full file from the media company. It took 2 weeks, but eventually they provided everything. Expense reports, attendee lists, correspondence between Hendricks Capital and the University Career Services offices. And there, in an email dated 3 days after the reception, was a message from Rosalind to Malcolm Porter. "I've made my decision on the analyst role. I'm going with Curtis Hendricks. He has the right combination of technical skills and cultural fit. Please prepare the offer letter." Cultural fit. I made copies of everything. Then I started digging deeper. I looked into Curtis's early years at Hendricks, the deals he'd worked on, the promotions he'd received, the evaluations that had been written about his performance, and I found patterns, small things, inconsistencies, decisions that didn't quite make sense unless you understood the underlying relationship. There was a deal Curtis had structured in his second year, an acquisition of a small technology company that had been valued aggressively, with accounting choices that were creative enough to raise questions. The deal had been approved personally by Rosalind. When the company had failed to meet its projections and eventually gone under, the losses had been quietly absorbed and never fully disclosed to Hendricks Capital's limited partners. It wasn't fraud exactly, but it was close enough, and it created liability. I compiled everything into a folder: documents, timelines, email trails, patterns of decision-making that suggested favoritism at best, conflicts of interest at worst. Then I started making anonymous calls, first to the SEC. I didn't make accusations. I just pointed them towards specific transactions that might warrant review. Then to financial journalists who specialized in investigating private equity firms. I sent them documents with key sections, highlighted, along with questions that led them toward the connections I'd already mapped. Then to industry watchdogs, compliance consultants, even former Hendricks employees who'd left on bad terms and might be willing to talk if they knew where to look. And then I waited. The story broke on a Thursday morning in late October. I was in my office reviewing a client proposal when my phone buzzed with a news alert. Hendricks Capital under investigation for potential conflicts of interest and financial irregularities. I opened the article. It laid everything out. The questionable accounting on the technology deal, the lack of proper disclosure to investors, the pattern of decisions that had favored specific deals and specific employees without clear justification, and buried in the 6th paragraph, carefully worded to avoid legal liability, was a reference to personal relationships that may have influenced early hiring and promotion decisions. Rosalind's name was mentioned 4 times in the article. Curtis's name appeared twice. By that afternoon, Hendricks Capital had released a statement. They were cooperating fully with all regulatory inquiries. They had hired outside counsel to conduct an internal review. They were committed to transparency and accountability. By the end of the week, Rosalind had stepped down as CEO, pending the outcome of the investigation. Curtis was placed on administrative leave, and the financial press had a field day. More articles came out over the following weeks, each one peeling back another layer. Former employees going on record about the culture at the firm, limited partners expressing concerns about governance, competitors quietly celebrating the fall of a rival. The investigation took 7 months. In the end, the SEC didn't file criminal charges. There wasn't enough evidence of deliberate fraud, but they did levy significant fines against the firm for disclosure violations and governance failures. Rosalind agreed to a settlement that included a ban from serving as an executive at any SEC-registered firm for 10 years. She lost her reputation, her company, and millions in legal fees and settlements. Curtis wasn't banned, but he might as well have been. His name became synonymous with poor judgment, with being in the wrong place at the wrong time, with being the person who'd benefited from a system that had now been exposed as compromised. No one wanted to hire him. No one wanted to work with him. His boutique practice collapsed within months of the scandal breaking. I never reached out during any of it. I didn't call, didn't text, didn't acknowledge what was happening in any way. I just watched. And I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, really. Not vindication. Just a quiet sense of completion. I didn't hear from Curtis for almost 2 years. When he finally reached out, it was through LinkedIn. A simple message sent on a Tuesday afternoon. "Hey, I know it's been a while. I'm in town next week for some meetings. Would be good to catch up if you're free. No pressure if you're busy." I stared at the message for a long time. I could ignore it. I could block him. I could let the silence finish what I'd started. But I wanted to see him one last time, just once. I replied the next day. "Sure, Thursday afternoon work. There's a coffee shop near my office." We met at 3 o'clock. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a cup of black coffee that looked like it had been sitting untouched for a while. He stood when he saw me, tried to smile, failed. "Thanks for coming," he said. I nodded and sat down. For a few minutes, neither of us said anything. I waited for him to speak first. Finally, he did. "I know I screwed up," he said. His voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "I made mistakes, a lot of them, and I've spent the last 2 years trying to figure out how I got here." I didn't respond. He continued. He been thinking about everything, about school, about how things went down with the Hendricks job, about whether I actually earned any of it, or if I was just, I don't know, lucky, in the right place at the right time. "Sounds like you've been doing some reflecting." "Yeah." He laughed, but it was bitter. "Lot of time for that when no one will return your calls." "What are you doing now?" "Consulting work, small projects, freelance stuff mostly. It's humbling." "I imagine it would be." He looked at me directly then, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Desperation. "I was hoping," he said slowly, "that maybe you could help me. Put in a word with some of your clients. I know it's a lot to ask, but I'm trying to rebuild, trying to prove I've learned from everything that happened. And I think if someone like you vouched for me—" "No." The word came out flat, final. He stopped. "What?" "No. I'm not asking for a handout. I'm just asking for a chance to—" I said no. He stared at me, confused, hurt. "Why? What did I do?" I stood up. I looked at him for a long moment. This person who'd been my friend, my roommate, the person who'd gotten everything I'd worked for because of a moment I'd seen through a half-open door. And I realized I didn't feel angry anymore. I just felt done. "You don't get to know," I said quietly. I walked out of the coffee shop and didn't look back. I never spoke to Curtis again. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he eventually found work at a mid-tier firm in another city, someplace in the southeast where people didn't follow New York financial news quite as closely. He was doing okay, not great, Not the life he'd imagined for himself when he'd graduated with that Hendricks Capital offer in hand. But he was surviving. He got married to someone I didn't know, had a kid, settled into a life that was fine but unremarkable, and I stayed exactly where I was. My firm continued to grow. We took on bigger clients, more complex engagements, higher stakes negotiations. I built something real, something that was entirely mine, something no one could take away. Talia graduated college with honors. She got into law school, one of the top programs in the country. She called me every few weeks, told me about her classes, her internships, her plans to work in public interest law. She still didn't know what I'd done for her all those years. Maybe one day I'd tell her, probably not. My parents were living comfortably in the house I'd bought them. My father's hands had stopped aching from years of loading trucks. My mother's knees had stopped hurting from years of scrubbing other people's floors. They thought I'd just gotten successful through hard work and smart decisions. They had no idea what it had actually cost. I built the life I'd been promised in that acceptance letter 15 years ago. But it came at a price. I don't sleep well, haven't in years. Lie awake some nights thinking about the version of myself who walked into that hotel ballroom believing the world was fair, believing hard work mattered, believing he belonged. That person is gone. I don't trust people the way I used to. I don't let anyone get close enough to see the parts of me that are still angry, still hurt, still convinced that the only way to win is to make sure everyone else loses. I won. By every external measure, I won. But I don't know what it cost me, and I don't know if I'll ever get it back. What I do know is this. I am no longer the poor kid whose life could be destroyed by a single betrayal, by one closed door, by one person who had access to something I didn't. I'm the one who controls the doors now. I'm the one who decides who gets in and who doesn't. I'm the one who built power so quietly and so completely that by the time anyone noticed, it was too late to stop it. And I live with that choice every single day. Stories like this happen more often than we think. Subscribe if you want to hear the ones that usually stay unspoken. And if this story made you pause, a like helps the channel grow.